wait, just checking if everyone can hear the bell. It's not gonna be on.
My speech is just going to be a mech fest because that's usually how debates work. The first thing I'll do is just ban all forms of zoos and aquariums. This applies to all contexts. Number two, we'll take money, we'll put it into alternatives. So specifically into funding things like documentary, into things like conservation centers. Note that this also means that education as a factor is also a wash. Actually, I'll probably win this because I'm going to prove why specifically there's a higher incentive to learn on our side of the house when you are and our forms of education are actually significantly better versus things like zoos, for example. So I'm going to just run two very simple arguments, and you'll be very clear after this why I win. Number one, on the incentive to learn. Number two, on the abuse of zoos and aquariums and why this harms ecology in general. One, on the incentive to learn. I think it's just two simple comparatives as to why specifically people will be more interested in our side of the house in terms of like conserving animals. The first is, I think most people have knowledge about the abuse of animals precisely because of things like popular culture. So it's precisely because of animal documentaries and exposés that happen in various zoos, for example, that like the prawning of shamu, for example, the large scale abuse of like the sea aquarium within America, for example, the torturing of lions, in various zoos, for example, which is why most of us already know there's abuse of animals. That's why most people don't even go to zoos to begin with. On the comparative, we think that on conservation, people feel more involved. We think that things like, for example, like the advent of things like glamping, for example, which is or like guided nature tours, for example, are all already things which exist on the comparative. We think that oftentimes these are significantly more humane because number one, there's no need to domesticate these animals. Number two, because you're oftentimes going to the natural habitat without disrupting. Number three, oftentimes you can do things like, for example, making sure that like you are zero waste within these areas. So oftentimes they are already hosted by individuals who have experience in doing things like conservation. Number two, I think it's very lame in terms of like zoos in general. I think they often just have diminishing returns. It's extremely hard to innovate zoos, and most individuals only go there once or twice. And the reason why this is very simple, because either you increase the amount of animals that you put inside, in which case like there's a high barrier to entry for them, or you just increase events. But these events oftentimes include the same enclosures anyways, making it extremely limited. On the comparative, on conservation, we think that things like, for example, documentaries have two general impacts. The first is that I think there's significantly more funding in the media in general, because of big media companies like Netflix and National Geographic, for example, who are all extremely like invested in terms of taking care of these kinds of narratives. If they don't have like the nature to take pictures of, then they also lose business. So there is an incentive for them also to actually try to conserve them. Number two, also the scale, it covers significantly more ground. The problem with zoos in general is that oftentimes you limit it to its tropical background, or you just limit it to like one particular like geographical space. The good thing about documentaries, however, is you can multiply this space by like a shit ton. So like you can do things like, for example, the Amazon rainforest, you can cover things like the Brazilian rainforest, the Singaporean rainforest, whatever rainforest you want. This is important for two reasons. One, I think that they cannot claim the impacts of fun. I think we should flip them. Number two, I think that contrary to things like, for example, increase in money and political incentive or our counterfactual, we at the very least argue that you have a lot more money. I think number two, the second thing on abuse of zoos and aquariums, but before I move on, the clarification from Salleh.
Yeah, so presumably conservation is symmetric because they rely on external parties outside of zoos to fund this.
No. So number one, we'll just take the money from zoos and like whatever like money you're using to maintain the zoos, which are often extremely expensive and requires a lot of money, and just refunded it back there. The problem with external funding in general is the fact that it's often extremely little and therefore not enough. But we think that specifically the amount of money that we're able to garner from things like, for example, maintenance of zoos could just be better allocated towards things like conservation of rainforests. I think this is very straightforward. Thank you, Salleh, for the clarification. Number two, in terms of the abuse of zoos and aquariums, oftentimes its bad infrastructure and treatment is traumatic for animals and make it tough for environmental conservation. One, because they're often taken out of their natural habitat and put into enclosures. So the polar bear in Singapore, for example, suffered heat stroke because of the tropical climate and it was extremely traumatic. But the counterfactual is that we're able to continue to track these animals, but also have them in their natural habitat, making it significantly better. There's three levels to this. The first is, I think that oftentimes they're constrained in space. That there's no freedom of movement. Whereas on the comparative, I think there's like freedom of movement is extremely important for things like reproduction. Number two, we think that there's oftentimes an abuse. There's oftentimes abuse for these towards these animals of domestication, which often leads to death. See like shamu in the American aquariums, where they like use electric cords on whales and they starve lions and they force them to reproduce, for example. The comparative is that we think there's significant focus on preservation. We think there's more ability to move, more ability to reproduce, but also that they don't die and if they die of natural causes. We think that there are concerted attempts to push for natural movement, which makes it significantly better. Two layers of comparative, therefore. The first is that I think that we are able to already garner a huge amount of money specifically from all the media that we're able to gain. Number two, we're able to save a lot of money specifically from stopping the maintenance of these zoos. In saving both of these amounts of money, you can put this money towards three things. The first is specifically the preservation of these places, so by hiring guards, by hiring security guards, by making sure you tag animals, for example, improving tagging technology, by being able to track these individuals, or being able to being able to like delineate markers and boundaries significantly better. Why is this important? We think that this also means that we're able to prevent poaching on our side of the house. Actually, the comparative is worse, because on their side of the house, what a lot of countries do, specifically even in the developing world as well, is that they poach animals to put into their zoos, right? So they actually, the zoos actively hire poachers to put these animals into their zoos and making it significantly more difficult for them to actually do any kind of economic conservation. This necessarily means that on our side of the house, that we are able to prevent these kinds of things significantly better, and we are also able to safeguard like things like, for example, the freedom of movement and the other better like benefits I just talked to you about. Note, however, the other side is going to say, by regulation, but this is at best mitigatory. Because the best case is that they try and preserve and prevent these things by two ways. The first is by replication, by replicating like the environment that they often live in. Two layers of response. One is how to replicate temperatures, because climates are often extremely different. See the polar bear example. Number two, not the same lah. You hang the meat on the tree to mimic hunting makes no sense, because the tiger still needs to hunt moving prey anyways. So like, unless you're gonna like, and it's often that's different, right? But number two, they can do things like, for example, maybe anti-abuse laws. But two things. Number one, the removal of itself already counts as abuse. I argue to you that just removing it from their natural habitat inherently is already abuse, right? Because you prevent all the kinds of rights and animal rights that already exist for them to begin with. Number two, or they take the trade-off that is not unique or cool, which further weakens whatever incentive they have, weakening any kind of funding they get on their side of the house in terms of the ability to safeguard these animals. Here are three comparatives. The first is that humaneness on our side is significantly better. If they die, at the very least they don't die in pain, and we mitigate whatever things like, for example, hunters like hunting them down, they are inevitable on both sides. And at the very least we are able to like reduce that to a significant degree. Comparatively, I think they die significantly less humane, because oftentimes they die by cattle prods, they die by pain. Number two, I think on the poaching level, they maybe protect them from short term, but in the long term they legitimize poaching precisely because it's a profitable way. If it's so indeed true, then on the other side of the house they're able to prove that zoos are profitable. But the way in which they do so is by poaching. The comparative is we have had significantly less poaching, we think that's relatively good. But last thing is extremely important, is the removal from habitat, like presumably is to stop extinction. But why do you want to stop extinction, right? It's precisely because the removal from ecology, the removal from ecology specifically, the primary goal of conservation is to make sure that like you don't disrupt the ecosystem. On the other side of the house, number one they do, which causes large amount of ecological harms, because like if you remove one predator, many people die. But number two, on our side of the house, at the very least you preserve the natural environment. This is precisely when you increase the amount of scale in animal state. For all these reasons, proposed.
Good, good.
Alright, thank you to the Prime Minister. Next up, oh.
Give me a second. Hostage. Oh no.
Where got? Only.
你我假假地好冇？ Okay. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. I think Wader is not wrong in the context he describes zoos at, but notice that this zoos at. But I think you need to notice that these contexts are extremely narrow and probably realistically do not apply to the vast majority of zoos and aquariums out there. I explained to you structurally why this happens. I think they try to overload you with a lot of like examples on how people are using cattle crops without actually like giving us the incentive breakdown why the zoos are more inclined to abuse animals, right? So far as I proved that zoos have an inclination to preserve animals more than to abuse animals, I think we kick this debate, right? Or at the very least, take that first layer of characterization out, right? Why is it, who runs zoos and why is it that they are very likely to be run in a way in which that legislation effectively measures them, and they are, even in a void of legislation, they're still likely to be at least humane to some degree. First, I think legislation is symmetric, right? Whatever status quo policies of protecting animals apply on both sides, whatever status quo animal advocacy groups applies on both sides. That naturally means that most degrees of social pressure groups also exist on both sides, right? The reason why Wader can come up here and put all of these figures and examples onto how zoos have been abusing animals is because these things have been actively called out. These zoos have actively apologized to them and paid the price of penalties, fines, whatever it is, or release, or whatever it is that these zoos have had to make in order to fix their public image, right? But second, why is it that this works even in a legislative vacuum? It's because these places, zoos and aquariums, attract the attention and patronage of nature lovers, people who are curious about animals, people who care about conservation, people who study about conservation, people who care about like preserving natural biology, right? The precise reason is because number one, they are likely to be individuals who spend time there doing their research and doing collecting their data because this is the most accessible forms of wildlife that they have within urban sectors or within like areas where you are not unlikely to find like other forms of ecology in your area. You can probably find penguins. You can study about penguins in Hong Kong because the Hong Kong Aquarium has them. You can't study about penguins anywhere else and inside Hong Kong. But second is that I think it's this probably provides a significant or if not majority of the percentage of people who go to zoos or patronize zoos are likely to be individuals who care about this, right? Third, why is it that social pressure from these individuals necessarily happen? Because I think because you have a high concentration of rare and endangered wildlife, that naturally means that watchdogs and NGOs are very likely to keep a close eye on to how exactly operations work. Second, I think it's very public, right? Like if you put an animal out there, how it behaves, you cannot necessarily very clearly control it. Or if you extremely clearly control it in an extremely abusive way, then people will call you out of it. I think like last thing is just a profit incentive. A sad zoo is terrible and it's not nice to be at, right? I've been to Taiping Zoo, there are great flamingos there. I hate that, right? I think most individuals rather see happy, healthy, active animals, and I think like for the very baseline, it's just not fun seeing an animal that's very clearly suffering. Let's talk about who runs zoos, right? Because I think that it's correct that private bodies oftentimes run them and they are very profit incentive, but that points us to one understanding is number one, zoos likely make profit. But I'll talk about why is that important later. But second, just notice that the infrastructure and expertise is required to build these habitats from the ground up necessarily means that you need a lot of expertise for the field about ecology and naturally about natural conservation, right? Because that likely means you're working very closely with ecological NGOs such as WWF, such as UN organizations, to actively try to preserve these habitats and figure out what's the best way in order to keep these animals alive and happy in the zoo, right? You don't want to keep importing animals in, you want to keep these animals there for as long as possible. I think that naturally means that you have huge amounts of people who know their shit in the zoo, and therefore naturally means that they are able to keep stable and healthy environments for these animals in the zoos, right? I think let's discuss the supply of animals because they say that, oh, you incentivize poachers under their act. I don't know why zoos need to go out and get poachers to capture animals when very simply, number one, there are trap release and breeding programs within zoos, in the current status quo where you get animals within reservation grounds or endangered animals from their natural habitats and then try to like repopulate them whilst putting them out on display so that like the individuals have an incentive to go to zoos and see and be educated about endangered populations. But second, I'll very quickly note here that like if you can work with people and get things non-illegally, then why are you going to do it necessarily illegally, right? Because you already have a close working relationship with wildlife foundations. Now, second, let's move on to a very principle. I'm moving on to my my principle class, right? Why is zoos going to be extremely moral? Because of this setup. We have a very fucking fucked up environment known as the Paleocene and the Human Age, which extends beyond like human population grounds, meaning that even in the deepest layer of the Amazon rainforest, you still get acid rain. You still get like desertification, rising sea levels, destroying swamplands. You get like large degrees of change in natural, even in pristine ecological conditions. These places are still affected by the tons and tons of carbon dioxide we release into the atmosphere every single day. They're still undone by the various amounts of like human impact that we've managed to like done on the rest of the Earth, right? What that naturally means is that if they continue with the status quo, is that we're just going to fund these glamping trips, we're just going to fund these reservations. That naturally means that animals that are left there are unlikely to be able to withstand rapidly changing conditions, right? The temperature has risen like I don't know by like 2 fucking degrees like ever since like in like 30-40 years. I think that severely this has affected large amounts of population animals in Nepal, right? Why is that important? Because I think zoos do valuable conservation work by bringing animals into a simulated environment wherein they can breed, and when they breed, take these populations out when they are mature enough to release into the wild and maintain steady floating populations, right? This is important, number one. It's supposed to be preventing extinction. That's a priori good in this debate because we're talking about animal welfare. But second, I think that it's important because it affects the rest of ecology, right? So we understand that because the rest of ecology, when certain animals in general go extinct, it creates like ripple chain effects throughout the food chain, throughout the food chain, causing further damage and harm. It's not possible under their side because number one, that of all the weather things. Also number two, you need time to fix like the ecological conditions that you have already introduced to these places. I.e., you need time to take the fucking cats and dogs out of New Zealand so that they are like native bird species don't get chopped out. You need all of these various different kind of mechanisms to try to resolve and find ways to solve these like natural ecological problems before they completely wipe out local species. Yes.
So on one hand, you want to stop importing animals and improve ecology and research because you need to reintroduce them. On the other hand, zoos actually operate on importing ecology and removing them from the habitat, harming the ecology. Which one is it?
I mean, like, you just need a breeding pair to get breeding people out, or you need to get a sufficient enough gene pool. I don't understand why it's so difficult to understand that. There are also conservationists who know more about this, who's working with zoos. I don't know why is it necessary to them. This is extremely harmful. Like, not logical, right? Two more points. Number one, on finance. because we can assume that zoos make money, that means that when you close zoos, you damage local economies. When people lose their job, that means that tourism goes down. That means that all of these ripple chain effects happen. That means that you are generally likely to enact extremely unpopular policy that will make it more difficult for your animal welfare groups under their side to fully do any public advocacy. Because first layer that they will take to is that they shut down my favorite zoo. Second, I think that it also necessarily makes it harms the animals. Right? A lot of these animals are contingent and rely upon humans like feeding and breeding them in order to continue surviving. You need to relocate these animals and toss them back into the wild. That creates a huge amount of cost that you need to do, right? I think what that means is that even if you get some degree of profit from closing down these zoos, you use those profits to just try to rehabilitate animals, release them back into the wild because you have no functioning breeding programs left because there are no zoos left to farming and create these stimulated environments for creating these breeding programs. What happens then is that these programs are likely to collapse because there's no external funds coming in, right? With that, I rest my case.
Thank you.
Alright, thank you to the leader opposition. Next up, we'll call upon the Deputy Prime Minister.
Where do you want to start?
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
Rashrvin says that's not consequential.
Yeah.
You're like a panda.
What?
You're like a panda.
Who is bullying him now?
Keep forgetting you're responsible. After that, you're like a panda.
Okay, starting in three, two, one. Animals are important. Zoos are not important.
Here, here.
Panel, I am very, very sleepy, so I'm going to make this debate extremely clear and very understandable for no-brainers like myself. I want to make a strategic note at the top of this speech about the opposition thus far, because it does seem like most of the elbows case has been very mitigatory in response to what Wayne gave you. Because of all the analysis our PM gave, in terms of how zoos are simply economically inefficient, are simply harmful towards animals, because not only due to a culture of abuse, but because of inevitable problems that are being posed towards animals on a biological and ecological standpoint, the only thing opposition has to say in response to this is to say, but zoos won't be that bad. Or there are plenty of
Here, here.
instances where zoos might not be abusive. As if relying on circumstance would substitute for analysis when and when not acknowledging that this is particularly rampant across multiple zoos in the real world. There are two reasons as to why this is not going to be strategic for them. A, because this is highly circumstantial. Because in the best case of their side, they don't actually really disprove the fact that zoos are still heavily profit oriented, that zoos still heavily prioritize their own money, and therefore
Yes.
also follow a lot of the analysis that we told you about, where they cut costs in order for them to ignore things like the well-being of their animals, where they cut corners in order for them to ignore things, for example, like keeping their animals within well-confined spaces. Of all of the things that they told you about being profit-oriented, they cannot be convenient with the way in which it applies to the behavior of zoos. They need to actually apply this across all facets of it, regardless of whether there are social justice movements, regardless of whether there are animal welfare groups, insofar as this is bringing in money, insofar as people people are still coming into the zoos and are still watching these animals, there is no reason as to why this abuse isn't going to happen. But secondly, very important frame here, this debate is a comparative, which means that even if they wanted to argue about the very minuscule amount of situations where a zoo is not all that bad, you still need to compare with all of the other empirical benefits that we came with, that thus focusing our attention onto conservation centers. We gave you a plethora of different reasons as to why all of these far more specialized areas, in order for us to protect these animals, is a far better alternative compared to that of zoos. We pointed out the massive financial strain that zoos place on you due to constant maintenance. There is no engagement to this. We told you that it's far less efficient or far less effective biologically for these animals. Still no engagement to this. Ultimately speaking, on an engagement level, opposition is on a back foot because they do not compare and they need to actually respond to this in their second speaker. But first issue that I want to talk about in today's debate: are zoos a safeguard or a threat to animals? Opposition says we have climate change, so we must protect animals by conserving them. Zoos are working with conservationists, and so we will be able to help protect animals. My response is this: if zoos are working with conservationists to protect animals, I don't know why those conservationists just cannot protect the animals to begin with. Why do we need to rely on zoos to be the middlemen in order for them to be the ones to protect animals? I would argue that these particular conservation sites are far better and they are far more guaranteed, because you cannot guarantee that zoos are actively following the extensive research protocols that opposition says that they will. But secondly, we told you plenty of reasons as to why it is harmful for you to support things like zoos, because the conditions it takes for you to actively get the animals into the zoos to begin with also are ultimately harmful, whether or not these zoos want to be economically and socially conscious or not. Because A, it involves the removal of these animals from their habitats. Regardless of what they responded to this TOI, you're still effectively removing animals away from their habitat and you're taking them away from where they're supposed to thrive. This means that animals like elephants are oftentimes exposed towards feelings like homesickness. There have been cases of dolphins and killer whales that have died of loneliness as a result of this removal of habitat. And all of this means that without the ability to thrive in their own environment, without the ability to thrive with their own family and their own home, this means that they are actively put into a massive psychological challenge and a psychological trouble that not only hurts them ecologically but also biologically. But secondly, within these zoos as well, the treatment that they receive is very, very harmful, because these are methods in which animals are still going to suffer, even in the best case where zoos wanted to maybe say be socially aware of all of these animal rights groups. They must be kept in confined spaces because you must always keep them visible for entertainment value. You go to zoo, you see gorilla. You must keep the gorilla in a small enclosed space. If you do not keep the gorilla in small enclosed space and you give it massive space for it to wander around, you will not see the gorilla. People come over to the zoo, people get angry because they didn't see the gorilla. But I think what is most important here is that of all of these combinations on all these combinations of different ways in which animals suffer under zoos, the most important thing is the principle, the contention that we made here at the start of the PM, and that is the importance of treating animals humanely. That means regardless of whether or not these particular zoos mean well or not, regardless of whether there are certain utile things that you're able to get from zoos in terms of animal conservation, the lives that you're able to save from zoos do not matter insofar as this comes at the expense of their own suffering and the expense of their own emotional hurt. There is no animal life that is actively being saved insofar as you're actively making them suffer in the process of it. And we believe that it is because of this inevitable process of suffering from zoos that this makes it a terrible thing for us to support. But final issue here, which side is more cost efficient? I think it's very important because this is a prerequisite for a vast amount of other operations we're able to conduct. Opposition says zoos make profit, therefore stocks. We tell you zoos can make profit but also have massive amounts of expenses. Your financial strain is still extremely big because you're actively trying to maintain all of these different stalls, all of these different animals, and all of them on a massively large scale because you're trying to actively make profit. And this has to be regular, this has to be active, and this has to be a massive cost these zoos accumulate over time. Compared towards us in conservation centers, where we don't actually need to artificially supply these animals with food. We don't need to artificially supply these animals with a way of life. But the way in which we have these conservation sites is we set up things, for example, like massive like forms of nature for them in order for them to naturally and organically grow and for them to reaccumulate to the wild. And that means that we do not need to actively maintain that. We do not need to actively feed them because on themselves they're able to feed themselves, and this is a far better way to rehabilitate them into the wild than they ever could have on the off. In order to save the animals, in order to save zoos, in order to save the government, you have to side with us.
Here, here.
Okay, thank you to the Prime Minister. Next up is Secretary of the Opposition. David.
Yeah, practically can do.
Hi everyone, my name is Salleh. I'll take my POI here, not in the chat.
Oh, thank you.
From also this team.
Okay.
And I'll just start my speech in a bit. I'm just out of my notes and my timer.
Can I give you PY by paper?
Can you POI in the chat? Basically, that would be great.
I'll just message you lah, telling you.
Thank you. He's ready.
Good. Okay. I'll start my speech in 3, 2, 1. So the first idea that I'm going to take down from this team is on regulation and abuse. I have many things to say here. The first thing to say is that there are experts that work in zoos because the job scope for this particular field is very limited, and these experts know best in taking care of what needs to be set up, i.e. ensuring that there's going to be a good environment so that these animals are going to be happy. The second is that there are profit incentives that zoos have where they want to preserve the longevity of the animals that you have there. And so you are not going to want to hurt them, like what this team says. The third is that hurting them means you are incurring additional medical costs. If the animal gets wounds, then they need to be healed so that the wound doesn't get infected, so they don't lose an arm or that they don't die. If they're depressed and hide, like what Gelson says, then you cannot attract people, so they want to make sure the gorilla isn't fucking depressed so that they can attract people. You also want to invest in good environments and consult ecologists and experts to ensure that you don't need to renovate these spaces in the future, so these spaces are actually really well maintained and are actually really well developed as well. You invest in things like good food and healthcare to ensure that they're alive longer. And notably, these are things that they can't get in the wild. And this team cannot guarantee that they're going to get a lot of animals in these conservation reserve forests and stuff like this, and I'll explain exactly why. But third, I think that there are training for workers as well, caretakers that are specifically taught to care for these animals in ways that are good. Or that there are workers that work there that are likely experts on animals. You literally need to write descriptions and information there, hence are likely to ensure the reduction in abuse because these are workers that are likely to be empathetic towards these particular types of creatures. And lastly, is that if the first is correct, that their abuse is going to happen and has already happened, and a lot of people know about this, presumably it's a reason that you would want to empower the types of call-out mechanisms that we talk about. Because a lot of people are aware of this, they're going to look at the zoos that they attend and see if these zoos are terrible, therefore are going to do more things like local petitions towards the local government councils to be able to make the zoos be better in the ways that they are not good. And note that this also relies on the public being aware, like what FIRST themselves mechanized about these types of abuses, because they themselves say that regular people are able to identify this. If their response is, this is on funding, if their response is, we will take the money from zoos and then we will put them into reservations and et cetera, then I don't know why we also can't do something similar in terms of taking money from other aspects of the governmental budget to fund things like preservation forests, because the motion doesn't say that we cannot do that. But also, I don't know why, if they say they're going to take the animals, they're going to put them in another cage, and they're also going to be caretakers for the animals in the cage, and people can also visit them. I don't know why this is meaningfully different than a fucking zoo. Before I go into the argument, I'll take a POI from Gelson.
Your case is zoos have experts, treat animals well, and have workers that love them.
Thank
What
you.
is the difference between a zoo and a conservation
Nothing,
center?
which is why they shouldn't be banned. Okay, argument. Nature is terrible alternative for these animals, and we have a principal duty to take care of these animals, or as many as we can, given that there is firstly an asymmetry in capacity, i.e. we are in better positions than animals. Animals are less capable than us due to being less intelligent. They can't fend for themselves, hence we ought to do this here. The second is that most of the plight of animals actually comes from the fact that humans created the harms that threaten or perpetuate this. Cheng said that it's things like water pollution and displacement from deforestation that harm these ecosystems. I'm going to give you several more reasons, and then I'm going to explain why they cannot get this type of preservation under their side of the house. Therefore, we win on this principal metric of saving more lives. So the first is water salination changing. Literally, the fact that increase of human-related activity in different types of water sources means that many oceans and rivers soon cannot house the exact species that are pre-existing there. Second, the development of animal survival mechanisms take too long to be able to adapt to this. This is because genetic code has a genetic lag, like generational lag, i.e. they need to be exposed to the same type of environment that then change their genetic code and DNA that then passes it on to future animals. The problem is that this takes too much of a cost in animal lives. Placing them in zoos, therefore, at least mitigates this harm, as you would then house them into suitable environments. And underpinning this, these animals also are not very good at taking care of themselves. Absent of a person to take care of themselves, we need to be able to intervene here and relocate them in better places. Importantly, this relocation can only happen through the justification, where most people would justify these expenditures when your government spends a fuck ton of money on this. Third is that there are natural predators that viciously harm and torture and murder these other animals because they're not separated correctly. The deaths that they're talking about then also happen all the time. Fourth, that they get hunted by other human beings where it might be uncertain whether or not they do this humanely. Why can't you have these same types of benefits of relocation and protection on Gov? The first is that the cost of creating these forests are things that are past just money. It's literally geographical limitations in terms of not having enough land to do this. Zoos in many countries are able to exist and get propped up in areas like cities because it's part of city planning and entertainment district or industry, which allows the justification of cost. Second, the money that you get is not an infinite amount under that side. In fact, their fiat is already being exercised a lot. It costs a lot of money to literally deconstruct aquaria from KLCC. You need to move each individual fish there, and then somehow justify spending recreating different types of environments for different types of fishes when we already have this in zoos that also need to get deconstructed as well. You need to pay for trucks to move all of the fucking sand that's in that fucking zoo. You need to do a lot of expensive things. A, we don't have set up costs. B, we have a mechanism to get money via participation tickets and entry tickets. Things like merchandise, things like donations that are effectively good because zoos cater towards people that love these animals. Thirdly, that this is a government policy. It uses government funding. The same funding that we have, if you say that you can displace them and repurpose it, we can also do it too, because the incentive to do this is symmetric. And fourthly, the conservation forests and tanks literally require you to kill and displace the other creatures that are also pre-existing there. So you need to reproduce environments by removing, for example, birds in a forest, because these birds would hunt these smaller fucking animals that you put there. The next thing I'm going to talk about is weighing. Why do we definitely beat this team? The first is that we are more certain in our protection. You also need zoo licenses, and I think this also means that there's going to be if the demand for zoos is symmetric, then something worse is going to happen under that side, which is that there are going to be black markets for these types of abuses where it happens more. Second is that we have significantly less suffering because we guarantee a more secure relocation for these types of animals. Third is that we have more secure funding in terms of government expenditure. We take significantly less longer and are not prone to the same types of hazards and risks that they have under their side. They need to ensure that they can go through this entire process without it ever going through disapproval in terms of parties changing, in terms of economic harms happening, which changes how you spend your money. For these reasons, we win.
In the yellow, next up with a lot. If you want to fill up the center side.
It's about zoos. And I just feel like I'm being library on Zoom.
But yeah, basically,
Maybe
if
it's not something like
going
save
to
or reserve.
oh, whatever I say is not meant to make fun of any members individually. It's just starting in 3, 2, 1. I thought this debate might be somewhat difficult, but my opposition told me you can have some rest, Rashrvin. Notice the objective of this debate is to say two important things you want to achieve. One is riches, second is to prevent this animal from going extinct. Let's look at the mechanism for research. They tell to us because people want to study about penguin in Hong Kong, we fly them over here. Two responses. One, I don't understand why do people in Arctic cannot study about penguin. You need to bring them all the way to Hong Kong to study. But secondly, Judge, if it's true you want to study the nature and habitual behaviors of this animal, how the fuck do you study this behavior inside the zoo when you contain them in a closed space? Not only already trapping the animals, now you're running away with inaccurate data under your model. That is why when you are using them under conservative forest, or like for example in Malaysia, Putani, Tepan and Iwakafan, all these places allows for you to research animals within their habitat, which allows them free roaming, organic growth and maximization of their potential. Second piece of problem then, they tell to us we should do this for reproduction. This is the main push coming from this. I have three responses under this. Number one, since corporations are profit incentivized, they cannot look after the whole family of the animal. If the animal has long lifespan, they oftentimes do things like vasectomy, ligation, to prevent these animals from reproducing on a mass amount of number. Because you need to obviously feed them more food on a higher frequency basis. But secondly also, Judge, I don't understand why in the wild these animals cannot reproduce on their own. They need the caretaker and pet person to take after them and then reproduce. Thirdly then, Judge, and notice this is important. They say we need to do this because they're natural predators, this animal will extinct. But at the same juncture, the parent animal is the zoo, but you're releasing the child into the forest because you want them to produce. So without the mother's or father's protection in the wildlife, how is the animal going to be prevention from extinct? That means you're going to run this on a continuous cycle of perpetuity while these corporations maliciously take away profit from them. But at their absolute best, Judge, let's assume extinction is something they can prevent. How many tigers you have in a zoo? 2, 3? How many cubs they produce in a year? 5. I don't see how you can reverse the whole extinction process if you're only letting out such a minimal number of limited animals you can release in the environment. This primarily kills off both of their pushes that they say these are justifications why we want to have zoos. The second piece of problem in this debate then is in terms of framing. Notice how they very conveniently say zoo and conservation forests are the same. No. Obviously there are differences. Number one, zoos oftentimes operate on a larger geographical scale, which Vader told you. If you're a snake, if you're a mate, if you're an ape, you're limited within a set of 4 pieces of wall or cages. But in the geographical habitat, you can jump from one tree to another tree, do whatever the fuck you want, fuck whichever animal you want to do. All this you're able to do under our life. But secondly then, Judge, notice how the cost argument has been constantly going under both houses, and I showed you why zoos are likely able to walk away with profit. The first step, notice on the framing why we told you there's a declining trend of people participating in the zoo. This is primarily because people are able to acknowledge that animals are being abused, it is not good. That means people have a moral reconciliation. If I buy ticket to go to zoo, I'm also funding the abuses these animals are going through. That is the first thing. Second thing then, zoos are much more expensive because of few reasons. Number one, your maintenance costs, wear and tear repairs that you have to do to. Number two, oil, diesel for the trucks that you have to transport food to different regions. Number three, you need to feed all these animals on a daily basis. These are expensive stuff, particular grades, tons and tons of meat you need to give. Number four, staff that you need to pay, zoologists, caretakers. Why is it then much cheaper under our world? Notice when you're a conservation forest, you don't need to buy them the food. They hunt on their own, they survive on their own, they're able to organically do things. The only thing you're likely going to do is hire forest rangers, put gates. Notice how these are all one-off causes, but under their world, it's a recurring cost. That's why it's much more higher than them. The last piece to just hammer this home, why is funding going to be much more better under our world? Notice their primary source to accrue income is to convince more people to come towards zoo, and you proven to it's a declining trend. But under our world, we are likely able to accrue more types of NGOs to participate in this. Because notice, environmental movements, not all agree the concept of zoo. Some agree, some don't agree. But at the point you should let them to be the natural habitat conservation, you're able to accrue help from WWF, United Nations Environmental Aid Programs. All these things which don't have the problem with moral reconciliation are able to pour money into our world. That means clearly to prove to you that the conservation forest under our world is much more better. Pure. Okay, 3 extraneous rebuttals to just hammer this home. Notice the mechanism of protection under their model is to say legislation works. I have 3 responses to this. Number one, your own analysis is self-defeating. Notice how they say people are able to track down instances of animals being abused, animals are being caught. That means there's an active trend of these zoos misusing their powers and abusing animals. That is why you caught them. But number two, notice that these are instances where people are able to find out. Obviously, these animals can't speak, they can't defend themselves, they're likely to put up with it. That means since they cannot compete and speak, the large amount of abusers are likely still going to be contained. But then third reason, Judge, corporations have an active incentive to make sure the business model follows. Obviously, if people find out they're abusing the wonder, they need to go bankrupt. So there's an active incentive to protect the way which deal these animals. They haven't given those mechanisms on a declining trend where corporations can still fund this. Third thing then, second thing then, they say people want to see clean zoos, animals to be well groomed, they have great emotion. One, I don't understand why the gorilla being happy or not, or the gorilla's hair is cut or not, is a deciding factor for a human to go and kill the gorilla in the very first place. But so secondly, then, Judge, this is not the reality. If Cheng has been to zoo typing, obviously he knows the Arapaima pond is so dirty, filled with algae, and there's no natural mechanism for you to clean because it's not out in the wild. There's not many fish in the sea that's able to eat them. But so secondly, oftentimes feces, all these disease infecting spread things, oftentimes left over there without being unclean. This shows, insofar as these corporations don't have mechanisms to treat or proper financial management to treat, animals are going to be left on the abuse. What are the things we clearly win in this debate that went unresponded throughout? Number one, the principal introduction we gave to you, why humans are in no social hierarchy advantage to abuse these animals, containing them and restricting of the freedom, no justification. Number two, we are the only side who told you why these animals, number one, organically able to maximize their potential as a living organism if they were to put into conservation forest. Number three, we told you why your ability to conduct researches are going to be much more accurate under our world because these animals are growing under their own habitat. Don't worry about tracking them or finding them. If you're willing to put them under a cage, putting a track device on them still enables you to track their movement and whatnot. These are generic things people do, tracking fishes in the sea and whatnot, where they go, what they eat and whatnot. But lastly then, reproduction is just an assertion, not mechanized, we deal with that. Lastly then, in terms of way, one, in which world do we fulfill human's principal obligation? We told you under our world, we're able to cater towards the best equal needs of animals, allowing them to grow what they need. But number two, we told you the ability for these animals themselves to grow on a maximum level potential as a sociological human being is better under our world. Number three, the ability for us to garner international support, local individual buys to support the cause of conservation forests is better under our world because we are in the absence of moral dilemma whether it's justified or not. Two other things we told you again when unresponded. Number one, notice how zoo license acts as an illusion for these people to conduct things like poaching, hunt animal. In status quo, illegal hunting is banned. Illegal hunting is not allowed. But because you have a zoo license and you want them to put in the jail, you're using the same mechanism, going against your own principles. So proud to propose.
Thank you to the whips. Next up, we end the responsive part of the debate with corresponding opposition. Next up is opposition.
Oh. Yeah. 3, 2, 1. A bit confused on what government is trying to tell us because they tell us that zoos are extremely profit oriented and they prioritize money, henceforth they're extremely abusive. And then their solution to that is if we want money, we get it from gambling, we get it from documentaries, and if we want research, we get it from conservation centers. A lot of layers of just ridiculous logic coming here, right? First, it's just that I don't think they deal with our layers and mechanism of why zoos are incentivized and have various degrees of check and balance to make sure that they do not and are in fact are not abusive, right? Look, I can hear Wade's sighing. It's because they think that, oh my god, I give you so many examples, can't you buy reality? But the truth is there's a lot of analytical reasons why zoos heavily cooperate and have close working relationships with conservation centers and conservation foundations. The truth is that very little, like even if vast majority of zoos around the world are probably not abusive, that's why they've been allowed to exist for so long, that's why governments have not banned them, that's why we have all of these reasons of like, but we see a trend of like zoos being part of rehabilitation and trap, capture, breed and release programs, right? And I think that realistically proves a lot of things, right? We point out a lot of various reasons of how we need close cooperation with conservationists to create good environments for your zoos. Why is it that observers can judge whether or not animals are likely to be abused? And all of these different mechanisms prove to you that like zoos are unlikely to be abusive. But let's take them, like, let's say that like zoos are somewhat abusive because of a profit incentive. I think the same happens on their side because their alternative mechanism is glamping, which is like if okay, their mechanism of why zoos are abusive because people go to zoos, they have to see the animals, feel the animals, feel like it's in the same room as you. If you go glamping, you go out to experience nature, you want to see the animals, you go out there, you don't see the animals, you presumably also make noise, and then you'll be like, I want to pay you, and then all of the problems happen in the same reason. All of the, literally the only absolving mechanism they have to prove to us why glamping and all these other alternatives work is by saying conservationists work with them. It's the same mechanism as why zoos can also be found abusive. Second, let's point out why exactly is it that their mechanisms are worse, it just evaluating on Rashrvin, right? It's because I think like the mechanisms of absolving problems in education and like fundraising is just bad, right? Glamping is extremely inaccessible. You take 50 ringgit to go to a zoo, you take 3,000 ringgit to go glamping, right? Documentaries are extremely boring. I haven't heard David Attenborough's voice unless I want to fall asleep, right? I don't think individuals are interested in going to seek out types of knowledge like this. I don't understand why this is the most direct and intuitive way for individuals to learn about animals. I think zoos are much more fun. They have an established scene. We've talked about repeatedly on how is it that they are very functional and very crucial in conservation and helping that. Last thing, I think that, moving on, I think that they also don't deal with our core case that we set up for first, is that the nature is fucked. Okay, natural habitats are fucked. They don't explain why is it that natural habitats are unfucked and hence it's okay for us to release animals back in the wild and just let them breed over there, right? Because they are, when we say there are actual ecological harms that harm natural populations that require us to capture them, breed them, and release them to maintain steady floating population numbers, they say taking them from the environment is pretty bad in the first place. I'm like, if you don't take them from their environment and put them in a simulated environment, they'll just die off naturally, and that causes various degrees of ecological harm, right? You cause food chain collapses, you cause like other species to go extinct or overpopulate, and then cause other species to go extinct. I think all of this is explained throughout all three speeches, extensively on why exactly is it that we cannot allow certain types of species that are kept in zoos and kept in breeding programs of specific degrees of importance to zoos and that have specific ecological value cannot be kept in zoos. Why is zoos the only mechanism why their conservationist centers don't work? It's because first, pointing out that oftentimes zoos, I think Salleh's speech explains it a lot, zoos have better, it's easier to get land for zoos. You can create zoos on already developed land, you create zoos through zoning. Second is just that zoos are self-sustaining as a financial ecosystem. You earn profit, profit goes back to maintaining animals. At the very in conservationist centers, you don't earn profit and you ask government for money every single time. Not explain to us why where is it that money comes from. And also I don't think it's capable of getting so far in the long term. At the very least, it explains to me zoos are more sustainable as a way of growth and more sustainable as a self-containing ecosystem, which is what we want to create. So yeah.
Good here.
Alright, thank you to each of this reply. Next up, let's talk about the government reply.
Yes. And let me not be so judgy.
Cheng, the reason I sigh is because after three speeches, it's just a lot of mitigatory math but zero comparative math, specifically from opposition. The problem is that they say we can make money, but I give you comparative math why we give more money. The response in reply, it was documentary is very boring. Then I'm like a bit late, that's number one. But number two, it ignores all the comparative analysis specifically from all three speakers. They say we can be more humane. We argue we are more, they say that they can be humane. We argue we can be more humane. That is like the literal comparative. Last thing, their silver bullet was, you forget to put down that you will do it slowly in your policy. Checkmate, bro. Then I'm like, okay, yeah, this is technically also responded in Gelson and Rashrvin. We can also co-op researchers and follow their lead, right? This is literally responses from both of them also that we can follow through. So, okay lah, sorry, okay, like, I never put in my policy, I don't like cleanliness, but then these two also cover my backside already, so I mean, this is actually quite okay. Two things. One, maintaining humaneness. I think the Freudian slip specifically for Andrea is quite clear where she says concentration camps. Like, yes, this is essentially what zoos are for animals, right? When she was like, this is a concentration camp. Correct, that's exactly what zoos are, right? The first thing that they say is that it's punitive measures that we fire them. But this means that they also cannot argue interest, because how do you like make your sea lion jump, 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 right? How to make your lion like jump through the hoop? You like tame them, right? Like you literally whip your lion, you pop your whales. Number two, but even if it's true, and you can maintain some level of humaneness, like all the other ways of conserving harms them too. Realize we tunnel vision specifically on the fact that you can have laws, but we gave you multiple reasons externally outside of laws and outside of things like, for example, like outside of things like laws and checks and balances. It's not the fact, like independent of whether you check and balance, the three mechanisms specifically on removing them from your homeland, on homesickness, on things like, for example, environmental degradation, on things like, for example, all these things, like are all reasons independent of why it's still abused, even if you buy the fact mitigation. The first thing that Salleh argues is that funding and it's expensive to deconstruct. Okay, so like also expensive to maintain zoo, right? Like maintain zoo will in the end become higher than cost for all the reasons given in first never responded to. So it's some cost fallacy at best. Number two, they say aha reproduction. Like the two things from Rashrvin never responded to. The first is that oftentimes it's compromised like domesticity. So if you release the tame lion into the wild, then they lose their mating sensors, then how GG.com, right? Because they get taken by other people. Number two, but also extremely small. Like it's also extremely small. Like you times 5 the endangered species, you reintroduce that into ecology, also will still die out anyways. The problem then becomes that there are a lot more other species that are not endangered, but you still display them anyways for the entertainment value. That is what Rashrvin actually does on the comparative. So two things. Number one, we argue to you specifically that the domesticity and the removal of the survival instinct to some the removal of the survival instinct must happen to some degree, independent of no matter how much mechanisms they give you. Because all four mechanisms that Salleh gives you are experts, laws, self-correcting mechanisms, are all mitigation. Because independent of all of these things, they will still have to suffer to some degree. Like, I'm sorry, but as of right now, right, no aircon strong enough to replicate North Pole conditions. So our Singapore Zoo too bad, the polar bear in the end up dying and become yellow color. Like a bit sad, but that's absolutely true. The second thing, in which the attempt by a silver bullet expert by them is because this jungle right got acid rain, then tio abuse. Then I'm like, still, like your acid rain not comparative to four-wall forced reproduction. Your acid rain not comparable to like multiple animals being abused. Your acid rain not comparable to poachers literally taking animals to bring them to zoo. Your acid rain, unfortunately, still not enough for all the harms that we talked to you about on multiple levels of scale and multiple problems that exist. Last thing, Salleh was like, but what's the difference between conservation and zoos? I'm like, wow, it's the fact you domesticate the animals. Like, you must domesticate them to some degree in order for you to get the money. So the biggest problem and the biggest difference, therefore, is that when you domesticate these animals, you also make them significantly more difficult to reintroduce the ecology, whereas on the comparative, we do it. For all these reasons, so far to propose.
Great. Thank you everyone for the debate. This is a silent round, so please leave this room and head back to the hall. I do not want to see your face for the next few minutes.